Hello, welcome to the podcast Byzantium Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. So I was looking over the list of episodes that I've posted so far, and it occurs to me that they are either about aspects of Byzantine life that we can identify with, such as how did the Byzantines read Homer, issues of identity, how did they experience Hagia Sophia, religious life, emotional life, sexuality, things like that. Or they're very directly about the modern reception of Byzantium in video games or films, or how we do and disseminate research. Today's topic is, fortunately, very far removed from our experience of life. I imagine this is true for most of you out there, unless you're downloading these episodes in some very interesting places. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the very underestimated impact of raiding on Byzantine life, daily life, the normal course of living in the Byzantine provinces. Now, for a number of reasons, this topic has fallen between the cracks. It's not very well covered in scholarship. There are a number of reasons for that, I imagine. One of them would be that it doesn't quite rise to the level of, warfare, as military historians like to talk about it. It's generally a smaller scale event, though it can take place in conjunction with regular warfare. But it's not a story of diplomacy and armies and generals and things that, according to an older conception of history, were the stuff of history. At the same time, as you're reading Byzantine histories and chronicles, it's tempting to dismiss these kinds of events as part of the background noise. Okay, there's a little raid here, there's a little raid there. There are periods of history when they're more intense or more frequent, but in themselves, they're reported generally very briefly, and you tend to move on. This is like, what can I make of this? It's not sort of a very impactful event in itself. Recently, some historians have begun to realize, perhaps again, that is after a period when the field may have forgotten the significance of the aggregate impact of all of those events. And in fact, now that I'm writing a Byzantine history from the sources, I kept coming across references to these raids so frequently and so impactfully when it comes to the quality of life in the Byzantine provinces, that over time I have become convinced that this was one of the key determinants in the daily life of the average Byzantine provincial. Whether raids are a frequent event, whether the state has the capacity to resist them, whether the state is creating the strategic environment to prevent them. And I'm beginning to realize that coping with this problem was one of the main preoccupations of the emperors and the whole chain of command and the court. And it was situated very precisely at the nexus of paying taxes locally to the central government for the purpose of ensuring some kind of mitigation of that problem. That problem was huge. It affected millions of people over the course of the centuries, but hundreds of thousands of people in periods of intense activity. And it had tremendous economic consequences, both in its direct impact on agriculture and pastoralism, but also in enslavement, in the experience of being carted away or forced marched away from your home to some foreign land where you're going to be a slave. And even if your relatives or the emperors or the church ransom you, in that case, given the amounts involved, the sheer numbers, the scale of the problem, this was a huge cash flow out of the empire to the surrounding peoples. So this was not only a huge factor in the life of the majority of Byzantine's men, women, and children, and their animals, but also it's the type of experience that they had most commonly that is the furthest removed from our experience of life. And it's possibly for that reason that it has been overlooked in recent decades, especially by scholars working in secure, affluent countries, which most of us are, where that's just not something on the horizon, literally. And we tend to focus more on aspects of life that we can identify with. Okay, maybe I'm speculating there a little bit, but it is a type of event that has been underserved in a lot of recent work. My guest today is Alexander Sarantis. Some of you may know him as the author of an excellent book on Justinian's Balkan Wars with that title. He's one of the best historians I know at, among other things, synthesizing historical narrative information with the archaeology of the regions he's studying. He's very meticulous and good at doing that. And it's precisely this approach that has enabled him to produce a synthetic argument about the socio-economic impact of raiding in the 6th century, looking both at the Balkans and the Near East and contrasting the two regions in the way they've been covered differently, both in the original sources and in modern scholarship. And in doing this, he's managed to avoid the trap of seeing these kinds of events as either part of military history, which needs to be written in a sort of grand military narrative style, or as very local events whose impact we can document through this or that excavation or chance find or coin hoard or whatever, but instead to produce a global picture of the aggregate impact of this type of activity on the lives of provincials and, in fact, the overall trajectory of the Roman Empire in this period right before it's about to lose most of its Balkan provinces to Avars and Slavs and others, and the East first to the Persians and then to the Arabs. So this is a pretty critical period. And so I thought it would be great to have him on the podcast so that you can get a sense of the kinds of risks to which provincials were exposed and the impact that had on the fate of the state as a whole. Many thanks again to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes on their platform. Here's my discussion with Alexander Sarantis. Hello, Alexander. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Anthony. Thanks for inviting me.
So, as I've been writing this history of Byzantium, I'm usually on the lookout for the following kinds of topics. I'm looking for things that our sources pay a lot of attention to, which they thought was obviously very important for their lives, for the history of the polity or whatever, to which modern scholarship has generally not paid a lot of attention. And so this is why I was so happy to come across your article, which is very long and substantial and makes a big picture argument about raiding, because I kept finding raiding appearing in the sources over and over and over again as something so important for the lives of so many thousands, if not millions, of provincial Byzantines over the centuries, and yet could find very little scholarship to give me a historical argument for how to understand it, what its historical impact and role was. So it's very happy you did that. And it might even be worth talking a little bit about why that topic has been avoided. But why don't we start with some basics first? So what is raiding and how is it different from other forms of warfare or aggression?
So, raiding across the frontiers of the Eastern Roman Empire. This was different from, for example, wars of conquest, in that the aim was not to annex territory. The aim was rather to strip the regions that were being attacked of their resources before the raiding armies returned back across the frontiers from where they come from. So these were transient military attacks. They didn't necessarily involve engagement with enemy armies, pitched battles, etc. They targeted by and large civilian communities. I'm sure we'll come on to the aims behind raiding, but the aims behind raiding, just briefly at this point, shaped the characteristic of raiding, because the aim was effectively economic on one hand, which was to bolster the resources of the polity or the community doing the raiding. At the same time, another aim which shaped the nature of raiding was political. A successful raid could confer political prestige on the group carrying out the raid. At the same time, it could damage the political reputation of the community or the polity that was being raided. So these economic and political aspects shaped the nature of raiding, which was transient but destructive, in short.
So what kind of resources are we talking about?
Well, effectively, on one hand, monetary wealth, valuables, but also more sort of mundane resources, I guess, foodstuffs, and I would argue in a pre-modern economic context, perhaps most importantly, manpower, which is mentioned by almost all of our sources which discuss raiding, prisoners of war or captives. In a pre-modern economy, really manpower was normally at a premium. So any way of boosting your manpower resources was really invaluable. So, I mean, manpower captured during a raid could be settled on land, put to work as farmers, farming communities, or they could be recruited as soldiers.
Or enslaved.
Or slaves. I mean, agricultural labor, slaves, there's often a grey area there.
Right. And sometimes ransomed back to the empire for money.
Yeah, and that could happen, that quite often happens during raids, actually. So in particular, if important members of the community were captured during a raid, perhaps even if a high-ranking official or maybe military man was captured, then they could be ransomed back during the raid, which was another means of bolstering the financial profit made from that raid.
So just for the purposes of picturing this, visualizing it, right? So we're talking about a group of armed men, usually on horseback, who invade, target civilian communities, probably agricultural, round up men, women, and children, possibly livestock if they have the time to, cart it back. Any valuables that they can find, especially, gold and such, and then just return to their native land or whatever, and probably entering into negotiations over the sale of prisoners or the ransoming, right, and so forth. So that's just generally the picture, right?
I suppose the only other thing in terms of resources, I mean, this was less frequent, and when it did happen, it was more often in the east, which was the plundering of architectural elements. Right. So the Sassanid Persians, on a few occasions, according to our sources, actually carried off bits of or entire buildings.
Right. I mean, so you mentioned the Sassanid kings. So our audience might be thinking, when we're talking about raiding, of a small group of Huns here, a small group of Saracens there, but mentioning the Persian kings implies that this is something that can be practiced on a state level. So who are, in more concrete terms, the people carrying out raids?
Okay, so in the paper I discussed the Balkan theatre of war and the Eastern theatre of war. So in the Balkans, up until really the 570s, I would argue, possibly even 580s, the groups located north of the lower Danube frontier, which separated the imperial provinces from the south, from the non-Roman regions to the north. The groups arranged north of this frontier were politically fragmented, small political entities. They were called by our sources barbarians. I would say probably more commonly in modern literature referred to under the umbrella term barbarian. They included Germanic-speaking groups in Pannonia, west of the Carpathian Mountains, in what we would think of today as Hungary, These included the Gepids and the Lombards who, of course, famously later migrated to northern Italy. East and south of the Carpathians, in what we would think of as modern Romania and Moldavia, you had groups of Sclaveni or Slavs, including the Sclaveni and the Anti. North and east of them, so north of the Black Sea, including areas of the Eurasian steppe, there were a number of fragmented Hun groups, and they come under various labels: Huns, Kutrugurs, Utugurs, Bulgars. So it was a very fragmented political situation. Later in the 6th century, the situation becomes more unified. We see the emergence of a much larger, more formidable state north of the lower Danube, centered in Pannonia, and this was the Avar Khaganate. And the Avars were from this world north of the Black Sea, from the Hun or the Bulgar world. They effectively conquered many of the groups north of the lower Danube, and they established this state in Pannonia. And so in the later decades of the 6th century, they were the main group that the empire was facing. So these are the groups that carried out the raids on the Balkans. In the east, you have as we just mentioned, the Sassanid Persian Empire. And this was the other great superpower in the Near East in late antiquity. An empire, enormous in geographical extent, with a centralized bureaucracy, standing army, network of cities, etc. And in the 6th century, the Sassanid Persian Empire fought a series of wars with the Eastern Roman Empire, and during these bouts of warfare carried out raids on the eastern provinces of the Eastern Roman Empire. Also in the east, you had the Lakhmid Arab clients of the Sassanid Persians. And this was a federation of Arabian tribes based, or at least centered on the settlement of Al-Hira in the northeastern Arabian Peninsula. And so that was the other major group. And they tended to carry out most of their raids across the desert into areas of northern Syria. So these are the sort of the neighbors, as it were, of the Eastern Roman Empire across the two frontiers.
Yeah, I sometimes get the sense that raiding across the Danube in the Balkan frontier was sort of part of the life and culture of a lot of these groups living on the other side. Like, hey, what do you want to do this summer? Well, maybe we can go attack the Gepids, or why don't we just go to Thrace, round up some captives or something like that. But your description implies that there's kind of a spectrum of aggressive activity, ranging from small bands raiding to raiding taking place in the context of war. And this is somewhat important. We'll come back to it. But I wanted to emphasize how raiding sometimes sort of falls between the cracks in our scholarship, because it often tends to be mentioned as a kind of trivial, sort of background event happening. These things are routine and normal. But when it happens in the context of war, the emphasis then is on the war, on the kings and the armies and the diplomacy and the big picture. And again, the ground level impact of raiding tends to be overlooked. And in my readings, and sort of in working through the sources for Byzantine history, like long term, like the whole period, we're focusing here on the 6th century, but this was a sort of perennial problem after the 5th century. I have found that raiding was a pretty fundamental fact of provincial life, especially the closer you are to the frontier, and it tended to shape, both the parameters of daily life and in the institutions that, especially of the state, in its dealings with the provincials, but that it had a tremendous impact, cumulative, right? 1 or 2 raids, not a problem, but if this is a persistent fact, right? So what kind of overall impact on provincial life and just provincial history could this series of, sequential recurring raids have?
Yeah, I think it's. I think the way to see it in both frontier regions is that at least raiding in the context of warfare happens in sort of concentrated bursts. periodically. I think there were periods of perhaps less violence. But then there were some communities, as you alluded to, for whom raiding was integral to their societies and economies, effectively. So I mentioned the Lakamid Arab allies of the Persian Empire. You also had another Arab federation of tribes, the Ghassanids, who were allies with the Romans. For these Arab tribes, I think it's fair to say raiding was part of their culture and part of their socio-economic structures. It could be invaluable to, for example, accessing or seizing control of pasturing grounds, especially when these groups were often nomadic or semi-nomadic pastoralists. So I think the impact of raiding on communities living in these areas, it was, during periods of endemic raiding, traumatic. I mean, effectively, this involved the destruction of settlements. It involved the plundering and or destruction of valuables and of resources. It involved the capture and or murder of quite often large numbers of people. So, yes, I think on a short-term basis, this would have been extremely traumatic for anybody in the line of fire, as it were. Obviously, and I think just to put this in some sort of context, I mean, there's been some very good work written on classical Greece on this topic, and also on Republican Rome. So the impact of warfare on an agrarian economy pre-modern. Yeah. So one book which I found very helpful was Paul Erdkamp's Hunger and the Sword, which is on the Second Punic War in Italy. The other one is by Hansen, which I think is called Warfare and Agriculture in Classical Greece, I think. And these books actually include the results of experiments of just how easy it was to destroy agricultural resources. So bearing in mind, these communities were subsistence farming communities by and large. They didn't necessarily have large surpluses. So even if the people who were victims were not carried off into captivity or were not killed, it was perfectly feasible that they might lose an entire annual harvest in one of these attacks. Right. So I think it's Hansen, for example, has all these statistics about how quickly, for example, even a couple of hundred men could burn or plunder, a few acres of farmland. Even more labor-intensive destruction of vines, for example, or olive trees, right, with enough men was possible. And whereas cereals would take perhaps a year to grow back, vines would take 3 years, olive trees probably longer. So the impact on a subsistence farming community could be dramatic of these attacks. So obviously, I think we'll come on to later in the discussion some of the sort of infrastructure that was put into place in these regions to try and effectively, I suppose, absorb the impact of these raids. But I think for the periods, as you mentioned, the periods in which raiding was endemic, it would have been very difficult to live and remain in some of these areas.
Right, especially if you lost livestock. That was also important, both for farming and pastoral, economies and so forth. And also the experience of enslavement, being carried off, right, and on what might have felt like a death march across the desert or across a river into, an unknown forest to serve who knows whom. I mean, that would have been horrifying. And the numbers involved, I have come to found, were sometimes quite high. In a previous episode, I talked with Noah Lenski about slavery in late antiquity. And part of that experience is precisely this, the experience of being captured by barbarians, for lack of a better unifying term, and taken off into a foreign land to be a slave. And in one of his articles on that, especially with regard to Attila, right? Because Attila seems to have practiced this like on an industrial scale. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who had that experience. And if you figure that the Eastern Roman Empire has a population at that time of, somewhere maybe in the 20s million people, a few 100,000 just, carted off by Attila and the Huns is not a small number. And I think that the Persians did the same thing in the early 7th century, like right after the period covered in your article is this big war. And I think the Persians were mostly after agricultural labor forces, so they carried off hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, it's hard to imagine the scale of that, right? But scale is precisely like at the heart of this problem, just as you said, because if you let one person loose on a vineyard with an axe, after a few hours, like how many are you going to chop down? But if you've got 200 or 300 men, you can do some serious damage. Anyway, but let's talk about precisely what you mentioned there at the end, the infrastructure. That is the way in which this experience prompted or structured sort of state responses, and by extension, the relationship between political centers like Constantinople and the provinces. So what could the Roman state do?
Well, I suppose the response, the immediate response, the ad hoc short-term response was military. So in both frontier regions, you had permanently stationed frontier troops, Confederate troops. But more importantly, for engaging these raids, you had field armies, mobile field armies, which could be moved around from one theatre of war to the other. So in both theatres of war, Roman armies were deployed against raiders to confront, defeat them, and/or impel them to leave. Another proactive military option was to launch a counterattack beyond the frontiers of the Roman Empire against the groups responsible for these attacks to try and encourage them to leave. I mean, this was the other way of doing things. From an infrastructural perspective, both regions received huge funding for fortification programs. And we see that this is actually probably to a greater extent in the Balkans, partly because the Balkans had already experienced bouts of raiding warfare for, over a century before the 6th century we're talking about, whereas the East actually had enjoyed a long period of peace with the Persian Empire from the mid to late 4th through to the early 6th centuries. So anyway, this money was effectively spent on building walls around cities, building military forts, watchtowers, cross walls were built. So in the Balkans in particular, you've got these incredible structures walling off peninsulas or approaching to peninsulas or particular regions. Probably the most spectacular is the Long Wall of Thrace, believed generally to be built by the Emperor Anastasius, which cordons off the isthmus, the approach to Constantinople from the Sea of Marmara to the Black Sea.
Yes, or the Hexamilion in the Peloponnese.
Yeah, this is one of the other ones mentioned in the sources. So and in addition to imperial resources spent on these fortifications, I think local people also invested resources in protecting themselves and their resources. So you have in the Balkans by the 6th century, this is a very mountainous landscape, but it really is carpeted in fortifications. Even off the beaten track, you find in places like the Republic of Northern Macedonia, you will find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of small hilltop forts. And it's impossible every single one could have been funded by the imperial government. So one of the interpretations is that these were sort of hilltop refuges, places where a local community could retreat at a time of insecurity and maybe also protect their livestock and their resources.
Yeah, I was wondering about those. So just physically, are they large enough to house, 100, 200 people?
They vary. They're often quite small. I mean, sometimes just 1 or 2 hectares in size, I guess. But they would be enough to, I would say, more like a sort of village community, perhaps.
Right.
So maybe in the tens rather than the hundreds.
And you also mentioned watchtowers. So what was their function? Is this just for people to observe the terrain from a high vantage point, and if they see an approaching column of riders to just race back to a village and tell everybody to run to the hills or something?
Well, I think there's not we've got evidence from watchtowers which have been recorded, which have been sort of loosely dated to the 4th through to the 6th century. So the archaeological evidence isn't great, but we know these structures existed, especially in the Hymus Mountains and along some of the passes. One of the ideas is that these were had a military function, effectively. I mean, it was an intelligence. So, as you say, lookout points, early warning systems. I think more generally, I've often thought of this infrastructure of fortifications as not just a defensive measure, but as, especially where the army was concerned, as a platform from which military force could be used against invaders, and also could be then launched north of the frontier. So it wasn't just the fortifications, watchtowers, crosswalls. They weren't just a question of defence. This was also a way of controlling the landscape, monitoring the landscape, and if you think about it strategically, a way of even perhaps funneling the raiders along certain routes into certain regions.
One might fantasize about them, having something like Greek fire on the top to warn people. They did this later in the 10th century in Byzantium. We know that this was used in along the eastern frontier, so much later, and they would have vigles, right, which is what they were called until in modern Greek times, right? Yeah. And they would have Greek fire and use it to signal. Anyway, I'm sort of sensitive to this kind of experience because of a story that my father told me. So when I was a kid, and he said that when he was a child on the island during the German occupation, there would always be people at the top of the hills looking at the road coming to the village. It's on an island. And if they saw a convoy of German jeeps, they would tell everybody in the village, who would then just disappear, just go over the hill. So that they would leave only a few people behind to negotiate, with whatever, captain showed up. Yeah. And the interesting thing about the village is, of course, that it was built on the side of the hill facing away from the sea. Now, this is the result of this is because of piracy. This is seaborne raids, right? And I should just add that those existed also, but they were much more prevalent problem in the later 9th and early 10th centuries in Byzantium. There was a lot of seaborne raiding. And so if you are concerned about attacks from the sea, although, you might want to have your village right there on the coast for all kinds of reasons, it was, from a safety point of view, advantageous to put it on the other side of the hill so you can't be seen and targeted. And so that began to happen around that time, I think around 900. But anyway, by the way, Alexander, you mentioned that the Roman armies would sometimes cross the border and go off and, cause some mischief on the other side. And so I'm wondering now whether there might be some kind of, ideological bias perhaps on the part of historians, where we treat things being done by Gepids and Saracens as raids, but what the Roman army does is like military pacification operations, right? Whereas, so I'm just thinking aloud here, what if there's actually, they're much more similar and parallel, and that were the Romans also carrying out raids, and, perhaps the barbarians are just responding to Roman raids, or that's how they see it. I mean, is that possible?
Yeah, I think certainly. I think your point about the Roman raids, it's the same about the Sassanid Persian raids. There's a tendency in both, I think, our sources, but this transfers to modern scholarship as well, a tendency to see warfare conducted by, inverted commas, civilized armies with, technology, with divisions, with uniforms, right, as somehow different, somehow organized, somehow rational. Whereas warfare conducted by smaller, more, inverted commas, primitive barbarian groups is somehow different qualitatively. It's irrational, it's barbaric.
They're amateurs.
And also it involves the mindless slaughter of civilian populations, whereas somehow, Romans and Persians are more keen on fighting ordered battles with each other. Right. But I think in reality, there was no difference. The only difference was scale. Right. Roman armies and Persian armies had far greater resources, larger numbers of men, and they could inflict more damage as a result. The Romans tended, in terms of Romans launching raids beyond their frontiers, this tended to happen, I think, more in the east than in the Balkans, especially during these bouts of Roman-Persian warfare. So I think 570s, 580s in particular, the Romans carry out a lot of attacks on Persian Armenia, Persian Mesopotamia. In the Balkans, according to from the sources we only really have sort of concentrations of this activity in the 530s and then again in the 590s. the targets being these Slavic groups I mentioned, south and east of the Carpathians. And actually, in the 590s, they also launched attacks on the Avars, based in Pannonia, in modern Hungary. But the nature, I'd say the fundamental aims and characteristics of these raids were very similar to those carried out by the neighbours of the Romans. So I think there's a very good passage in the military manual, the Strategicon, possibly according to some written by the Emperor Maurice. This military manual was written in the late 6th century, and it seems to have been written in the context of Balkan warfare, a number of indications. Right. And it has a chapter on how to approach warfare against different groups, different enemy groups. And one of the groups is the Slavs. And one of the instructions is how to campaign in Slavic territory, things to watch out for, how to organize your troops. And one of the key instructions is how to burn and plunder Slavic villages.
Right.
And I can't remember exactly the details, but the gist of it is, you need to separate your forces very carefully so that the village is approached from multiple angles. This would ensure no one gets out.
Right.
So this is, the aim is effectively to plunder, to kill, to burn as much as possible. So it's very, there's no different in the core aims. And I think I should add that really, manpower resources, foodstuffs, perhaps in the northern world to a lesser extent valuables, were very important to the Romans as well. And, raiding was just another way of getting access to these resources.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a striking incident in the early 5th century, and this was, it kind of worked out that way to the Romans' benefit, but not in the obvious way. So there was a barbarian raid across the Danube, the Sciri, I think, not sure, and they were captured, and the court at Constantinople basically auctioned them, and we have a law in the Theodosian Code, right, which says. I think you've discussed this somewhere, maybe in another article. We're accepting applications now from any landowners who want to, buy off some of these, and like send a proposal that lists like where you're gonna put them, and it's like so bizarre. It read like a modern application process, but anyway, yeah. So
there's been some very good work on, the 4th and 5th century empire as a whole, including the Western Roman Empire. Relating this issue of the migration of groups from beyond the frontiers into the empire, relating that with the need for manpower,
right.
and landlords' need for manpower, labor.
Yeah. But I think we should also be sensitive to the possibly ideological way in which these things are represented sometimes. Again, that barbarians raid, but Romans have a proper military. In the long course of things, it strikes me that the early Roman Empire, especially with regard to the East, was the aggressor usually. Like if you think of, Trajan, Septimius Severus, all these people, like going and beating up on the Parthians was something that you did for status. No different from what you mentioned earlier about, barbarian chiefs who, they need to lead their war band on a raid against the empire just for rewarding their followers and, that sort of thing. But I think after that, on balance, the Persians were probably more the aggressor afterwards. After Constantine, maybe. I think Constantine was planning an aggressive war when he died. So there is this there's a problem of the politicization of some of this terminology. But you interestingly note in your article, in fact, you have a whole analysis of how the politics tends to play out a little bit differently by region. That is, that these kinds of events, when they happen in the Balkans, are described differently than the way they happen in the East. And this is both in the sources and in modern scholarship. So can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, why do we configure them differently?
So this was one of the core themes of the paper, and actually it's been a core theme of quite a lot of things I've been interested in and worked on. So the Balkans, as I mentioned earlier, had a very different history in the 4th and 5th centuries from the eastern provinces. The Balkans had experienced lots of invasion, warfare, lots of immigration, demographic change, and also a lot of destructive warfare, I think it's fair to say. And by the time you get to the 6th century, we're looking at a very different region in the Balkans from what had existed in the early 4th century, for example. So gone are Roman villas, Gone are classical type Roman cities, by and large. Gone are probably most of the original civilian secular elites from the region. What we're looking at here is what I often call the proto-medieval landscape, at least in the central and northern Balkans, of, as we've just been talking, hilltop forts. The cities are often hard to distinguish from forts. These are small fortified settlements, often maybe having a church, some administrative buildings, a barracks. The elites, in addition to churchmen, we're looking at military men, many of whom are of, inverted commas, barbarian descent. And as a result, I think and on top of that, the groups that are accused of raiding the Balkans are seen as barbarians, as particularly primitive, etc. So in our sources, I think it's fair to say the Balkans is often viewed as a sort of barbarized, militarized backwater. And when some of the, perhaps classically educated authors who work in the administration, etc., write about key figures, emperors, for example, who came from the Balkans, including Justin I, Justinian, they're seen, if they want to be rude about them, they're seen as boorish, barbaric themselves, in a way, uncultivated.
Yes.
So I think this has an impact on how warfare in the Balkans is viewed. It's seen as somehow irrational, barbaric. Raiding is seen as something that regularly washes over the region. The region is often seen as neglected somehow, left vulnerable to these attacks. The people suffering terrible fates and these horrible, gruesome atrocities inflicted by animal-like Huns, etc.
Right.
The East, by contrast, is a completely different world. The East, as I mentioned, hadn't experienced warfare really in the late 4th and 5th centuries. This is a landscape, very much a Roman landscape of large cities. There's a lot of economic. I should have mentioned the Balkans wasn't really an economic powerhouse in the empire. It was quite sort of. The eastern provinces were agriculturally fertile. They contained big cities, centres of commercial exchange, wealthy, religious, secular elites. Obviously, you had the army as well in the borderland regions. So this was a very different world, effectively, by comparison. The enemy was the often viewed as equally sophisticated Persian Empire. So warfare in this region is viewed through a different lens somehow. It's more civilized. It's viewed through a Thucydidean lens. These are great battles with generals giving wonderful speeches. And so we don't get, and I would argue that the narratives in our sources on Eastern warfare, they're not centered around gruesome atrocities inflicted on civilian communities. I mean, if the Persian kings who were leading these raids decided to punish a civilian community, they did so for rational reasons. For example, that community had refused to give up or refused to pay them a ransom, so they punished them to send a message to other cities. And this is no different from what Eastern Roman generals and armies do during their conquests of Africa and Italy, for example. So warfare is more civilized, more rational than it is in the Balkans. And yes, these are two very different sort of pictures we get.
Yeah, when I read it, I realized that you're absolutely right, but I hadn't realized it exactly because, it's kind of a latent bias. And to give a striking example of how this bias plays out is that Procopius doesn't have a book in his wars dedicated to the Balkan front or theater. And this is something you pointed out in your book, Justinian's Balkan Wars, way back when. And it's quite true. I mean, he's patched the Balkan episodes into digressions, right, in his other wars, leaving it a sort of very incoherent kind of play. Like he wasn't even bothered to make sense of it. And it's like focusing on stories of atrocities and Slavic raids and things like this. And you pulled all that together along with the archaeological evidence and showed that it's a coherent space that the imperial administration is paying quite a bit of attention to, and is quite possibly more important for it than the adventures overseas that Procopius, obviously witnessed and he wanted to talk about. There is definitely that kind of imbalance. And when you're talking about warfare between Romans and Persians, the classicizing instinct automatically kicks in.
Of course, yeah.
Right. So it's like, this is my opportunity to be Herodotean or Thucydidean or whatever. And it creates this very lopsided kind of impression. So I mean, I'm really happy you've come along and corrected all of that. So what was in the long term the different trajectories of the Balkan front and the Eastern front, especially with regard to the impact of raiding and when they escalated into these huge wars that eventually were fought in the 7th century. So how did those two regions come out looking different?
I think the answer to that question is related to what we were just talking about, actually, which is that rather than being a neglected theatre of war, in the first half of the 6th century at least, I would argue that the Balkans probably received a larger amount of imperial funding than most of the other theatres of war. It was an expensive region to control and administer. It was mountainous, inhospitable. It was difficult to control as a unitary state, to control from without. It required a lot of resources in terms of fortifications. It required a very proactive diplomatic policy. It required, I think, an energetic political policy just to keep on side the various military groups and military leaders who were relied upon to defend it.
Right.
The East, by contrast, I would argue, was less reliant on state funding. There were other sources of revenue for local elites in that region. And I think this lies at the heart of the different trajectories of these two regions, because what happens really in the final decades, for the first half of the 6th century, by and large, both regions, they both received imperial funds for reconstruction projects in the aftermath of warfare. They both received imperial support, etc., large armies and these sorts of support. But really from the 560s onwards, as is well attested in most scholarship on this subject, the empire experiences two problems. One is a budgetary fiscal problem. It starts to struggle to cover its expenses. The other problem it experiences, which I think more could be made of actually than has been, is it for the first time in imperial history, it has to face two juggernaut opponents on two frontiers at the same time. I may be wrong, I don't think this has happened at any point in Eastern Roman history in late antiquity up to that point.
Right.
And the Emperor Justin II makes the mistake of provoking wars with both of these rivals.
Right.
The Avars in the Balkans, the Sassanid Persians in the East. So from the 570s onwards, things are much more constrained. And this means the imperial government is no longer able to supply resources to both frontiers as it had done. At this point, it's clear the priority was the eastern frontier. And so most of the armies get sent to fight the Persians, at least until the Persian War ends in 591, when some manpower is rediverted to the Balkans. But effectively, what this all means is that from the sort of last 3-4 decades of the 6th century, these regions are no longer receiving the same money for reconstruction projects. However, we see two very different trajectories. So according to the archaeological evidence, which is probably our best evidence for long-term socio-economic trends, from the late 6th century into the 7th century, the Balkans experiences some sort of economic collapse, or at least, sudden downturn. Right. We see the end in many regions of coin circulation. We see the end of pottery imports, signs of trade. We see settlements being abandoned, or at least depopulation to an extent, far fewer people living in these places. And also lots of evidence for destruction. By the time you get to the mid to late 7th century, you're looking at a much smaller, really very small regional simplified economy. In the East, we see nothing like this economic collapse. There's a lot more continuity of what we might call a Roman settlement pattern, a Roman society and economy. And that runs into the 7th century and the great wars you're talking about. I mean, cities survive. Sometimes there are signs of stagnation in the later 6th century. So major Syrian cities like Antioch and Apamea seem to have experienced stagnation, which could be linked to bouts of warfare. But certainly we see nothing of the collapse we see in the Balkans. Cities survive, monetary economy survives, trade continues, and people continuing to live in a Roman-style society and economy continue to exist in these places. Even at a time of reduced imperial funding, and later on, in fact, the withdrawal entirely of the imperial authorities from this region, as indeed happened in the Balkans. So,
right.
So I would argue the big difference is that the East is able to show greater resilience than the Balkans because it has these powerful local elites, civilian elites, who have sources of funding other than state funding. So the region's economy is not just reliant upon the fiscal machinery of the Roman state, but there are other sources of funding. I would argue it's a region agriculturally wealthy enough to produce a surplus which wasn't just used to pay taxes and to feed soldiers, that there was enough left afterwards to sell on a private market. I mean, this is a region with very large cities, large centres of population, which needed feeding. It's also a region that sat along trade routes which connected Asia with the Mediterranean, etc. So I think this is one big difference. The Balkans, by contrast, especially the Central and Northern Balkans, had never been really an economically prosperous region. This was a tax-consuming region rather than producing region. So I think once the imperial authorities started to basically withdraw funding, perhaps withdraw involvement from this region, it's hard to see what was left, really. And I think this would explain any elites who remained in the Balkans from the late 6th century onwards were either unable or unwilling to continue funding the construction or reconstruction of Roman-style forts, cities, monetary economy, etc.
You make a very good argument for that in the article. And fortunately, there's still some journals willing to publish long articles where we can put all of this data. And it was fascinating to read. And I think you're right. Whatever Balkan elites we encounter, they normally tend to be people who had left their communities and joined the imperial administration or the army. And that's how we know about these people, like Belisarius, right? Whereas in the East, it seems that they could do that, but there were also opportunities at home to have actual careers in their cities, and they're devoted to their communities, and they continue to build things there. And you just get a very different sense of the socioeconomic resources that these two regions have. And I want to come back to the topic of raiding, because I think it's very important as a factor in explaining this history as well. I mean, it is what you said also, but it's rare in history when we can, we can't perform controlled experiments, but as close to it as we can get. In the 7th century in the East, we have the regions like Syria, Palestine, Egypt, that were conquered by the Arabs, and very quickly they're conquered in a decade. So there had been some massive disruption from the Persian War, which 20 years, raged for 20 years earlier. But the Muslim conquest was very quick, and those areas generally recovered. And those resources that you were talking about were there. And so while, they were not exactly long-term the centers of Islamic civilization, especially once it moved to Baghdad, and places like Antioch even sort of faded in importance, but it didn't just disappear the way a lot of the, Balkan, towns or, the imperial infrastructure just disappeared. By contrast, if you look at Asia Minor during the 7th century, right? So after 640, when it's subjected to constant raiding by the Arabs, many raids a year often, that were just highly disruptive, carted off so many people and livestock and so on, Asia Minor just remains depressed economically for a couple centuries until the Romans finally, get their act together, or they manage to push back. And I think that the different trajectories of, say, Syria, Palestine, even Egypt on the one hand, and Asia Minor on the other, after that point, is due to raiding. But that's just
the only area that I'm still trying to grapple with, because my current work's on the 7th and 8th centuries in the Balkans, is to try and play. I mean, the Balkans, as we mentioned, goes into this sort of economic, sometimes called a dark age. It's a much more simplistic economic period, and we're still trying to understand what happened in the region. But the interesting thing is to compare the Balkans and Anatolia in that 7th to 8th century period. Because Anatolia, as you mentioned, experiences a series of raids by pretty formidable armies over a period of decades. The Balkans, by contrast, we don't really know much about raiding in the region after 620s, really after the Avar Slav Persian combined siege of Constantinople. The Avars stopped being a threat to the region. Because the imperial authorities withdraw from a lot of the region, it becomes clear that there's not really much to raid there. There's not much point in raiding.
Oh, that's sad.
So I mean, one of the conclusions I'm reaching is that the Balkans probably experienced less brutal raiding in the 7th and 8th centuries than it had done in the 5th and 6th, when there had been something worth attacking in the region. So then it's a question of, trying to compare. It's very interesting, this comparison between Anatolia and the Balkans, which they do undergo a number of similar developments, albeit obviously Anatolia retains the imperial military infrastructure to a greater extent. So it's almost as if what happens in Anatolia in the 7th century is more similar to what happens in the Balkans in the 5th and 6th centuries, when it's raided by, repeated endemic raiding, but there's a sort of fortification infrastructure there.
So I guess it's possible to be victimized so much that you come out the other side. It's like nothing to see here, folks. So wrapping up, I just want to pose a more general question, and that has to do with how little this kind of phenomenon has been discussed in recent decades. And I think it's so important that one could, just sort of thinking aloud here, one could even write a history of Byzantium from the standpoint of raiding and its responses to raiding, because that ties in with all of its infrastructural investments, the role of the army, right? The mutual understanding between provincials in the center that were being taxed, but this results in increased security. And we actually do see signs of a sort of normative expectation on the part of provincials that the Roman state will protect them, and that's why we're paying taxes for. In addition to all of the infrastructure and like the way in which imperial investments in regions, or even investments by local elites in their regions, played such a crucial role in determining their historical trajectory vis-a-vis attacks, from the outside. And yet there's very little scholarship on all of this. And comparatively much more scholarship on topics that and on a pragmatic sense, affected very few people, or the lives of very few people. I struggled with this in writing, say, the history of the let's say 8th and 9th centuries, which in the scholarship are overwhelmingly dominated by a concern over iconoclasm, which, like a lot of recent scholarship, and I'm in agreement with it, sort of downsizes that as as the impact that it had on people's lives. Like, I don't think most people really cared or were impacted by this at all. It's a few dozen people in the administration, the church and monasteries that are fighting over it. I'm simplifying here a little bit, but I think that in terms of the existential footprint of the event in question, right? Whereas raiding was what it was about. It was, how can the state muster the resources and the organization to counter this, to defend its territories in order to extract taxes more securely and efficiently, in order to invest in the army. And I see the 8th and 9th centuries as this long but ultimately successful effort to roll that back, stop the raiding, and eventually go on the offensive, which they do in the 10th century. Like, that's what it's all about. For the lives of so many millions of people, that effort was the most important thing going on. And yet, we don't talk about it that much. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts. I have some thoughts about this, but they're amateurish.
I think the point is that in a borderland region, and of course Byzantium eventually, especially in the 7th and 8th centuries, becomes one big borderland region.
Yeah.
But in the up to the 6th century, the borderland regions, raiding was endemic. It was an integral part of relationships across frontiers. So it was part of provincial life, and as you mentioned, it shaped a lot of what we see on the ground in those borderlands. I think the problem is, in terms of scholarship on the Balkans, I think raiding does feature quite prominently. We do hear about it, but certainly in terms of the other parts of the Eastern Roman Empire, and in terms of late antique and Byzantine studies as a whole, it is marginal, I think it's fair to say. There are all manner of reasons. I think more broadly, warfare is not particularly popular or fashionable in our academic field at the moment. There are all sorts of reasons could be put forward for this. People writing in the West, most of us haven't experienced warfare ourselves. Most of us haven't been attacked by armed men on horseback, luckily. For us, warfare is something that happens out there, in Afghanistan or Iraq. We read about it in the newspapers, but it's something that doesn't affect us on a daily basis. And I think that has an impact. I think also in modern academia, we're under pressure to write, to publish things that have some sort of impact or relevance to the modern world. Therefore, the impact of climate change or environmental change on societies' economies has much more resonance, as it were, which is, I think, another factor. I think our sources don't help this. I mean, the primary sources we have also compartmentalize these things. Procopius, he sees, warfare as something. He writes a book specifically on wars, and wars, they're quite sort of, he doesn't tell us about society in social economic contexts in which those wars took place. The wars take place in a vacuum in Procopius's work. And of course, many people at Constantinople, for them, probably warfare was something that happened out there on the frontiers. So I think a lot of this relates to the fact that maybe borderlands and frontiers aren't that popular in modern academic research. And modern academic research on late antiquity in Byzantium, for me, is probably more interested in, the works of elites in central regions of the empire on theology, on philosophy, etc., which perhaps, weren't related to warfare so directly. Whereas, as you mentioned, in borderland regions, everyday life was potentially impinged upon by this violent activity. Socioeconomic history is the other point. I mean, socioeconomic history is often written separate from military history, which I think is probably a bigger problem, because especially in borderland areas, or even areas interior from borderland areas, you can't really separate warfare from socioeconomic history, as far as I'm concerned. But I think the problem with socioeconomic history is that the evidence is often archaeological, as I mentioned earlier, and it's often not very possible to date precisely. So it tells us often a lot more about longer term trends, which are very hard to associate directly with the short-term impacts of warfare. This was one of the themes of the paper. So it's quite easy, if you're writing socioeconomic history, to dismiss political and military events which have a short-term impact, because they don't actually often or always relate to what you're seeing in the socioeconomic evidence. So, yeah, I mean, a number of reasons, really.
Yeah, I'm just putting together the things that you're saying. I would add that even within the domain of military history or writing scholarship on military history, these experiences of raiding tend not to be foregrounded, because even scholarship on military history tends to focus on armies and soldiers and institutions and diplomats and states, and it's a big picture, and doesn't often get down to the more sort of granular level of agricultural communities, livestock, and precisely all of the socioeconomic structures that you were talking about. That almost seems like a different field now. But precisely the historical impact of the constant raiding is on those structures.
Yeah.
And so unless you're attuned to the concerns of, peasants and provincial, communities, and their, if you were to ask them at any time, if you're taking a poll of, likely voters, what are the topics that concern you the most? And they would probably say the raiding. But that doesn't figure into our category for military history.
No.
But I think that a lot of things were taking place on the ground that even the rulers of the empire were attuned to, and they could see.
Well, in a way, raiding sits at the juncture between top down and bottom up, because, raiding, as you say, it had a very stark ground level effect. But it was also, intertwined with politics in a borderland region and diplomacy. Right. It was a tool of politics, effectively. And I suppose one final point, another point which relates to this is that raiding, another problem with raiding, or raiding has, it often gets conflated with migration. And this isn't so much an issue, I think, in the 6th century, because the 6th century was a period in which the borders didn't change that much. If groups were settled in the empire, they were settled on imperial terms. In other words, the empire invited them in. Yeah. But in other periods, if you move to the 7th and 8th centuries in Byzantium, or the 4th and 5th centuries in the Western Roman Empire, you often have, inverted commas, barbarian, raiding, and migration as a sort of couplet. And they're often seen as pretty much the same thing. Whereas in actual fact, they're completely different activities and developments with very, very different impacts on a society and economy. Raiding, as we've talked about, was destructive. It was transitory. migrants or conquerors moving to a region, the last thing they wanted to do was to destroy or to force out its resources.
Right.
The main reason they moved there was to exploit the resources. And as we've talked about, the number one resource was manpower. So this idea that sort of barbarian raiders would come in and sort of kill everybody, force everyone to leave, makes no economic sense.
Yeah,
it's a different activity from raiding entirely.
we should do another discussion on migration. And boy, is that a relevant topic, if anything. But for now, for raiding, we're out of time. This was wonderful. It really clarified, and your scholarship as well has clarified for me some of the issues that I was struggling with. It's trying to bring this into focus as the nexus of so much that was happening in East Roman history. So thank you, Alexander, for sharing that with us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.